Welcome to welcome back. I hope everybody had a very joyous and special Pesach. Hello?
Yes.
Oh, we did.
Okay, great. Should we begin or should we wait for another minute or two?
Well, there are four of us here. I don't know what time everybody else is going to dial in.
Was there a Yom HaShoah program in the shul tonight?
I think there may be some in several shuls.
Okay, so either way, we're going to start. I'll wait another minute just to give whoever is interested the opportunity, but we'll start in just a minute or two. Either way, we won't go over time. I know today it's a busy time right now. Everybody has the Marmakomos?
I don't get it. I don't know. For me, it's all hassle.
It should be
That
on
was the same one as last time.
Yeah, the same one as last time.
I didn't have it last time either, but
I think if you click on the email, there's you can also print it out.
Chazan, there's a little link on the email. It downloads it. You can open it and then print it.
yeah, I know. Okay, next time. I am not the greatest expert about that in this matter. I'm an expert on other matters, but
More important matters.
but that's okay. It's okay.
Okay, so we'll start in 1 minute, and either way, we'll. I'm glad that everybody had a wonderful Yontif.
Yeah, Baruch Hashem.
Yeah.
You were home, Rabbi, or you went away like every night?
No, we stay home for Pesach. All the years so far, and we have a lot of family that come over. We had
Sure.
a lot of our children and grandchildren, different parts of the Yom Tov, but we have 5 of the 7 families for the Seder, so that was
Nice.
Yeah, getting everybody in the house and sleeping, that was challenging, but in a good way. So
Of course. But how old was the youngest one to ask the 4 questions?
we had about let's see, I'm trying to remember how old everybody is, like about a 3-year-old or 4-year-old.
Wow.
Nice. We had younger than that, but in terms of asking, we had
we had our 18 years old grandson, who is
so nice.
He's the one who spoke with you.
Yes. He said he's staying in your home right now. Yeah.
Naftali, yeah, I call him Naftali Ropschitzer. And
that's his background.
Because he's named after my father, who was named after Naftali Ropschitzer.
Started yet.
Right. Okay. You should have nachas.
I think we can start, Rabbi. I don't know if the chairman is not there.
Okay, no, we'll start. So, okay. So I think the last time that we met was, about, 2 weeks ago, pretty much before Pesach, because the last year that we had was a year that I gave, co-sponsored by the shul and in memory of my father. So that was on the topic of, Pesach, and then the one before that was of Gittin. So it's already a few weeks ago. So let's just review just a little bit with the Gemara that we are dealing with. So the Mishnah, establishes in the beginning of the Masechta, which we were discussing, that when a person brings a get mi Medina Sayam, he has to proclaim b'fanei nachtam. He has to establish that that the document is a legal and authentic document, and the the Gemara discusses why it is that we believe him at all, because typically as we all know, two witnesses are, whenever there's some sort of a requirement for witnesses, when it comes to a monetary matter, and certainly a matter connected to ishus, to marriage and personal status. So whenever that is the case, it's always shnayim edim al pi shnayim u'shlosh edim yakum davar. That's what the Torah says. So this is the question that the Gemara asks. If you have it here on Gimel Amud Aleph, it's probably on page 3 or 4 in the Mar Makomos, or if you have the Gemara in Gimel Amud Aleph, the Gemara says Ularava. So the Mishnah says you have to say b'fanei nechtam. Rava was of the opinion that the reason that you have to make this declaration is because of the concern that there might be a challenge to the validity of the shtar. As you have this get, which goes up in court, the woman is, interested in continuing with her life, so she wants to, let's say, remarry on the basis of this divorce, and the judges, all they see is a piece of paper which is signed. There are two signatures on the piece of paper. The actual witnesses to the event, if there were any, don't have to be in court. That's what a shtar, that's what a contract, is. So the question is, why, if there'll be a challenge to the, validity of this document, let's say the husband will come to court and he'll say, this is a fraudulent, bill of divorce. So what will happen then? So Rava was of the opinion, Rava Amar Lefisha Ein Edem Mitzuyim Lekaimo, says the Gemara, that the reason that the shliach, the messenger, the agent, has to declare it was done in my presence, b'fanei nechtam, was written and signed in my presence, is to obviate any kind of legal challenge later on, because now we have the support of the agent, of the shliach, who says this is all a valid document. So the Gemara says, how can you get away? How can one person who declares that he has knowledge of the validity of the get, how can that be enough? It's not a question. I'm sorry.
It's not a question that he saw it. So he's an Eid Echad.
Right, that's the problem.
Yeah.
The problem is, why should an Eid Echad be sufficient to establish, the authenticity of a bill of divorce? You should require two witnesses for that. We should require higher standards for that. So that's what the Gemara says, Libai Trey. This is the Gemara in Gimel Amud Aleph, or if you're following in the Mar Makomos, it's probably on page 3, the bottom of page 3. After all, mididahava kim shtaros dialma. When let's say there was a real estate contract, and let's say there was a dispute in the court whether or not this real estate contract was signed by legitimate witnesses or whether there was forgery. So you would need two witnesses to authenticate the signatures, not one, because in Dinei Mamanis, matters of money and being motza mechaber alav araya, you need two witnesses. So why here, when it comes to personal status, ishus, we're saying that she, is divorced and she can remarry, why is it enough to have one person establish that this is proper get? That's the question that the Gemara is dealing with. So the Gemara says, no problem. The reason is because you do need two witnesses when it comes to, a court case dispute, about facts. However, to authenticate a document, maybe it's enough to have one witness, because in certain areas of halacha, we have a principle, eid echad ne'eman b'isur. One aid has credibility when it comes to matters of isur v'heter. What does isur v'heter mean? Let's say, for example, the best example, kashrus. Right, let's say there's a piece of meat, and you don't know whether or not it's a kosher meat. It came from a kosher butcher store or from a non-kosher butcher store. Or, it has this ingredients or that ingredients. So we don't need two witnesses to establish that. It's enough that one witness will attest to the kashrus of the food. That's called Eid Echad. A single witness is Naaman B'Yisurim. He has credibility when it comes to Yisurim. There's a difference between Eid Echad Naaman B'Yisurim and the requirement of Al Pi Shnayim or Shlosha Eidim Yakum Davar when it comes to matters of personal status. So the Gemara says you can't rely on Eid Echad Naaman B'Yisurim if we're talking about a bill of divorce, because that only applies in things like kashrus. Eimer da amrinan Eid Echad Naaman B'Yisurim. When do we say Eid Echad Naaman B'Yisurim? Only kagon chaticha safek shel chelev, safek shel shuman. Meaning you have a piece of meat, like I said before. It's kosher meat. It's not kosher meat. We're trying to identify, where it was bought, what its ingredients are. So that's called Yisurim. And we have a principle, Eid Echad Naaman B'Yisurim. But that's because lo is chazak Yisura. We don't know about the, presumptive or prior status of this meat one way or another. We come to, it's like a neutral object, right? You have this meat and we're trying to figure out, is it kosher meat or non-kosher meat? It's not like it has a history, that it used to be non-kosher, we're trying to figure out if something changed it into kosher, right? Or vice versa. So that's called lo ischazak Yisura. There was no presumptive previous state to override. Aval hacha, but in the case of an eshes ish, of a woman who was married, she has a presumptive state. We know that she was married. We all attended her wedding, or even if we didn't. But the point is that she was married to this fellow. Now there's a doubt whether or not their union ended properly in divorce, in which case she can go on with her life, or whether or not, what's that?
It seems that there is a status to an Eid Echad in terms of Ne'emanis.
Yeah.
And it may be that, and there are other contexts in issues where Ne'emanis is taken as sufficient to justify a conclusion. I'm talking, for example, when there is a question as to whether
you talk about, for example, Eid Echad b'misa sabal.
Yes.
So that might also be the
b'misa sabal, and also if yeah, exactly. That is
so. That's a great question. The question is whether or not these aren't the two. So actually, the Gemara in Masechet Yevamos, in the beginning of what's called a Isha Rabbah, Perek Isha Rabbah, the 10th Perek of the 10th chapter of Yevamos. So in the beginning of the 10th chapter of Yevamos, which deals with this issue, we have almost exactly the same Talmudic discussion. There too, the Gemara, the Mishnah seems to say that if a woman, that's a great point that Rabbi Roth brings up, and welcome, Rabbi Roth. Good to see you after Pesach. So the Mishnah says that if a woman hears from a single witness that her husband suffered, a death, he fell off a boat in Mayim Shein by himself, or this witness, evidenced, was there when he was pronounced, no longer alive, or saw his demise in one way or another. So the Mishnah seems to say that she can get remarried. The Gemara in Yevamos asks exactly the same question. They almost have exactly the same discussion there. The Gemara says, how can she get remarried on the basis of a single aid? So the Gemara there exactly says that, it's Eid Echad Naaman B'Yisurim, which is what Rabbi Roth was quoting. Eid Echad Naaman B'Yisurim means even though it's one witness, this is considered enough credibility, to establish, his death and therefore her freedom. So the Gemara says they're exactly the same thing. And I'm going to read it. Just give me 1 second, so you'll just because it's such a good point. This is the Gemara in Yevamos on Daf Peches Amud Aleph. It's exactly parallel discussion that we have here regarding a get. So just to make it clear, the Mishnah says in Yevamos, in the beginning of the 10th parak, Ha'isha sheholach ba'ala l'medina sayam, a woman went to, her husband, went off on sort of a voyage or a trip, ubo v'amru, and then people came back from the trip and they reported to her, nes balech, that your husband died, right? So the Mishnah discusses bin nises, and she gets married, on the basis of that evidence. The achakach ba'bala, and then of course the husband shows up. It's called baharog baraglov. The dead man supposedly,
That's amazing.
What?
Was it Trias Amazing?
Either Trias Amesim or the reports of his death were, exaggerated. Same idea. So, so if he shows up, then it's a terrible problem because, even though no one intended it, she was an Eshes Ish and she, ended up, having a child, let's say, with another man while she was married to the first man, and that's a problem of mamzeros. Anyways, so the Mishnah has a bunch of cases. The Gemara says, "Midiktani seifa nises shelo bershus muteres lachsa shelo bershus bezdin elbein mechal dereisha bershus bezdin ubeid echad almeid echad naman." So it's exactly where Rabbi Roth is coming from. You see from the Mishnah that there are two cases. One is you had two witnesses. They came and told her your husband died. She took it at face value and she got remarried. The other is she came to court. She asked the court, can she get remarried? Because she herself was more dubious about the whole thing because only one witness showed up. But the Gemara says, well, it must be that one witness, when there's no problem, that Bezdin will give permission to get married. How could that be? I mean, you need two witnesses. So the Gemara says, then they prove it. Utsnanam is another Mishnah that says, Husaka lios masian aid me pied. Even hearsay allows her to move forward in her life. In other words, let's say the one witness shows up. He says, I didn't see your husband's, accident that he died, but I heard from my, from my friend that he was there and he told me, and I'm telling you that in a court of law, that's called hearsay, right? Aid me pied, meaning the aegis isn't direct. It's, somebody else reporting about somebody else's testimony. That's called hearsay.
But it's still only one aid.
Exactly. So the Mishnah in saying that when it comes to Misa Sabal, not only is one witness good, even an indirect one witness is good. So the Gemara says, like, how could this be? So the Gemara says, it's not so terrible. Because it's like exactly what our Gemara says here. So the Gemara's response in Yevamos, which I'll maybe get back to a little bit later on, is similar to the Gemara's response here, which is it's one thing to speak about Eilechad Neman B'Yisurim if you have a piece of food, you have some food, and you're not sure if it's kosher or non-kosher. It doesn't have any history, and we're now confronting its status, and we are going to trust the Eid Echad. However, Aval Hacha is Chazik Yisur de Eshes Ish have a davar shebe'erva ve'ein davar shebe'erva pakas mishnayim. And the Gemara says exactly the same thing by Misa Sabal. The Gemara says, how can you rely on it? Here you have a presumptive status that she is married. The doubt is whether or not anything changed that, meaning, was there a proper get? Or in the case of the Gemara Nivamos, did the husband really die? We know that they were married. We're not sure if he died. So that's called as Chazik Yisura. Moreover, this is a debate in the Rishonim here. Why do we need both the factor of Chazik Yisura and the factor of Davar Shebe'erva? But either way, personal status should require two witnesses, and Chazik Yisura shouldn't work with one witness, even if it was only Yisurin, frankly. So there's a double reason why not to trust an Eid Echad, not in our case of, whether a suffix get, and not in the case in Yevamos of Eid Echad b'Misa Sabal. Yet we do trust him, so we're trying to figure that out. So the Gemara says here, I'll tell you what the Gemara says there first. The Gemara there says, you know what? You're right. It's a special exception in Eid Echad b'Misa Sabah. Why is it a special exception? There are different Gemaras, but the Gemara that I was quoting before, Daf Peches, which is parallel to this Gemara, says the principle is mitoch shehichmarta aleha b'sofa, right? Hekalta aleha b'tchilasa, which means because Isha Medak Dayek. So that's what the Gemara says there, which means the following. She knows that if she, is too precipitous, if she jumps into a new marriage, based on evidence that, is not going to survive scrutiny, that she's only hurting herself. It's a disaster, right? She's going to marry somebody else, and then it's going to turn out that her husband is really alive. And what's going to happen? The Mishnah says, Teitze mizeh mizeh. She can't marry the new husband, and she can't remain married to the old husband either, because she.
So it's high risk, high reward. So is that what we're saying?
Well, this is high risk, and therefore.
No, the reward is she can marry. We say Eid Achadam B'Yisurin. That's a reward.
Well, yeah, it's a midrabana. What we're saying is that likely. She is going to leave no stone unturned, meaning she may be relying on the Eid Echad, but she's only going to rely on it after launching her own investigation or after being very convinced about the veracity, the honesty of this Eid Echad. Meaning she is not going to jump quickly into accepting the word of the Eid Echad.
And therefore, this is all Yevamos. Therefore what?
And therefore, at least on a Drabanan level, it's an exception to the normal rule, which would require two witnesses. Now, whether that exception is Doraisa or Drabanan is a debate among the Rishonim. Like the Balitosis in Yevamos say, even then, the reliance upon Eid Echad remains only a rabbinic, not a biblical foundation. Others say no, because she's going to do this extra investigating. So the combination of her added, caution, and, the rigorous, investigation that she's going to personally launch, and the words of the Eid Echad, maybe Minat Torah, that also, changes the equation. But in the end, the Gemara seems to say that it's some sort of an exception. So Roth is right, but it's actually parallel to our Gemara. What about here in Gittin, when we're talking about the validity of the get? What's the answer here? So here the Gemara says something sensational. And this is our topic. The Gemara says, no, bedinu dekim shtaris nami lo liboy, k'reish lakish. The Amar Reish Lakish had Maksum Alashtar, Nasa Kivisha Nechkor Idusan Bebezdin, Barabanan Hu Da Atzroch, Bahachim Yishumaguna Akilu Baraban. See, here the Gemara's answer is as follows. The Gemara says, listen, Minato, if this were a biblical problem, what happens here? Right? It's not, an Eid Echad coming and saying that the husband died. That was the Gemara in Yevamos. Right? Here the problem is you have a get. A get is good enough to free her, but the concern is that maybe this get is a forgery. So we're asking an Eid Echad b'fanei nechtam to establish that it's not a forgery. And if we're really concerned about it being a forgery, how can we rely on the Eid Echad? After all, this is personal status.
But the Eid Echad is not as vested as she would be. I don't understand the comparison. The case of Yavam is she's going to get very penalized if something goes wrong. Let's say the Eid Echad's wrong here. What happens to him?
Well,
he ruins his career in Eidus.
If the Eid Echad is wrong and she gets married on the basis of his authority. It's the same problem. It's the same problem, except that here the Gemara is not giving. Here the Gemara is saying something different. The Gemara is saying the whole problem in Yevamos, it's a Doraisa problem, and the question is whether or not the solution is good enough for a Doraisa problem. Here the Gemara is saying it's not a Doraisa problem and therefore the rabbinic reliance upon the Eid Echad is enough because the problem isn't a Doraisa problem. Why is it not a Doraisa problem? The Gemara says because we're not worried about forgeries ever. Well, we'll say we're not worried about forgeries because of the din of Reish Lakish, who says that the shtar protects itself. The shtar is the equivalent of two witnesses, not Eid Echad, and the shtar therefore says about itself, Eid Machasumim ala shtar. When you have a contract with signatures, Nasa Commission it's as if there was interrogation. It's as if they came to court, they testified, they were interrogated by the judges, and were found to be credible. Now, if that's a virtual statement, because none of that happened, that's what.
Yeah, but if you hold Eddie Masira Karsi, that doesn't work, right?
Right, we're talking about Eddie Chasima here for sure. So if you hold Eidei Chasima Karsi, that's a great point, and and you hold the principle of Reish Lakish. As far as I know, no one ever argued with Reish Lakish on this point. It's a very remarkable thing. Reish Lakish, in its most, we're going to discuss the scope of Reish Lakish, like what does it apply to? But even if you were to minimize Reish Lakish to the extreme, in other words, you were to say Reish Lakish is to be understood in the most minimalist way possible, it's still extraordinary because the witnesses didn't have to be present at the Gerushin. They just signed on the document in advance. And certainly, there's nothing, that establishes objectively that this scrawl, this ink on a piece of paper represents two witnesses. So in a way, what Reish Lakish is saying is that the shtar protects itself, or the shtar validates itself, which is a catch-22 kind of a problem. Number one, it's also a pragmatic problem, and this is what Tosas asks in Ksuvas on Chavches. So look at Tosas in Ksuvas Chavches Amud Aleph for a minute. That would be on page 4, probably. That's the next entry, is the Gemara in Ksuvas Yudches. No, actually, skip a page. We'll come back to that in a minute. Go to probably page 5. Is that right? I'm interested in Tosas on Chavches Amud Aleph. Okay, so let's. Everybody have that?
In Gittin itself?
No, in Ksubas.
In Ksubas.
On the Marmakomos.
But Rabbi, is there a chashash, the fact that the woman is going to put a lot of effort to investigate the whole situation? She's
going to put that effort in the case of Eid Echad B'Misa Sabal.
Yeah.
She doesn't need to put in that amount of effort in the problem of authenticating the get, because Minat Torah, we trust the get, even if it's not authenticated.
But is she concerned? She doesn't want, of course, to become an aguna. Does aguna?
Yes, of course. That's the whole point here of the Gemara. The Gemara is saying, Mishum aguna hakilu barabana. That's what the Gemara is saying. The Gemara is saying, Minat Torah, a shtar protects itself. That's the rule. That's what we're trying to discuss a little bit, understand a little better. That's a remarkable idea. It's remarkable because it's paradoxical. What I keep calling a catch-22. What I mean by that is, meaning saying, how do we know that we can trust that this isn't just a forgery? The answer is we trust it because it's testimony, because of what Reish Lakish says, that people who sign on a contract, it's as if they are witnesses who are interrogated. Yeah, but how can they be witnesses that were interrogated if we're not sure if it's a forgery or not? That's what I mean by the paradox. So, but nonetheless, that's what Reish Lakish says. So we'll see how far that goes. But because of that, the Gemara is saying the concern for a forgery, though the concern for, that this isn't an authentic document, is only rabbinic concern, not a biblical concern. And since it's only a rabbinic concern, but still, as rabbinic concerns, shouldn't it still need two witnesses to establish the signatures, like you do in a real estate contract or a loan contract? There, you would require, two witnesses to establish that the signatures are authentic. So that's what the Gemara says, Mishum aguna hikilu rabbanan. Here, we want to make it easier for her to move on with her life because we don't want her to end up trapped by having more rigorous, requirements. So what's fascinating, let me go back to our Gemara just for one more minute, just to finish that off. So what's fascinating is that the Gemara itself says, we've talked about this in the past, but it's this Gemara. The Gemara says, so the Gemara says, Hai kulahu chumrahu. Di mitzrachas leitrei lo osi bala ma'aru pasale, chad osi bala ma'aru upasale. So now the Gemara says, and this is, I as I mentioned, I think this is like such a powerful exchange, because most people who don't really understand, these kind of issues, because they don't think about it so much, and they're not, let's say they don't have the experience or the immersion, in these kind of topics, they tend to think in a very linear way, meaning, are we lenient or are we stringent? If we're lenient, then we should have, more relaxed standards. And if we're stringent, then we really impose very rigorous, conditions. But what the Gemara here is saying right now is that, in life and in law, it's more complicated than that. Because sometimes when you relax the standards, sincerely, because you want to make, out of empathy, you want her to be able to move forward in her life, etc. But you're also creating greater risk for her, right? If it all blows up in her face. So what the Gemara is saying, the example here is, is Gemara saying like this: if you have one agent or one witness who's saying b'fanai nachtam, and because of that, we're going to let her go forward and remarry, then aren't you kind of inviting a greater likelihood that the Baal will challenge in court? Because why shouldn't he challenge? He only has to face and overcome a single, witness. So even if we rely on it now, are we going to rely? You're also risking, or you're courting, the risk of an appeal. Whereas this is always true, right? If you have more rigorous standards, let's say you said you wanted two witnesses, so it's true she wouldn't be able to move forward as quickly because she needs two witnesses to establish that the get is a get. But on the other hand, the benefit is that once there's an ironclad, validation of the contract, then, the likelihood of somebody challenging it, is much lower. So it's not a question of, let's be empathetic or let's be, draconian in how we treat, these vulnerable populations. It's more a question of what's the right balance, because if you don't have, when you do one thing, there are unintended consequences. This is true for, standards, in general. The Gemara says the same thing about, lending standards. You want to encourage people, let's say, to lend money to other people. I'm talking about the halakha right now, also in the business world, right? Because liquidity, is the key. That's why, as we know, like everybody's panicking because of, interest rates, because, it limits, the free flow of credit. Credit, is always, an entrepreneur's, avenue for success.
Salvation.
So you want to increase, you want to encourage. Why do you want to do that? You want, for the sake of the lova, not for the sake of the mal, for the sake of the creditor. I'm sorry, for the sake of the debtor, not for the sake of the creditor. Especially halacha, particularly, we're not just worried about material success. We're worried about, the needs of those in need of the debtor. But so the principle is shalotinol delas bifnei lavin. We want to make sure, we sometimes make extra enactments to make sure that credit will flow, and that, creditors will be encouraged, to lend. And in the case of a Jewish loan, let's say, to lend even without interest. But typically, when the Gemara applies the rule of shalotinol delas bifnei lavin, it's related to raising the standards, that will guarantee repayment for the malva. for the creditor. Meaning, the goal is to help the debtor, but the mechanism is often to create greater confidence of collection for the creditor. If you ignore the standards that will help the creditor, then in the end of the day, short term, it looks like you're helping debtors, but really the credit's going to dry up very quickly. So there always in anything that you do in life, it's a big statement, but I think it's true. There always needs to be, a calculation, an assessment of, of the pressures and the counter pressures, which is why you have to kind of, create a balanced system where there is confidence. So that's true with regard to, religious standards, legal standards. So that's what this Gemara is discussing. This Gemara is saying, listen, you want to help a woman move on with her life because of the principle of aguna. But if you, lower the standards too much, so short term it'll help her, but long term, you're inviting challenges. Like Gerus, right? I don't want to get into the details of this at all, frankly, but a conversion, let's say. So, there's always fights about standards, of conversion. But and then there are objective questions too that I'm not going to get into right now. But let's assume that even that there are, there's room for a certain amount of flexibility. You have to, so to enter into the Jewish people is a big deal. And let's say you want qualified candidates to be able to do that, assuming that halachically it's acceptable, definitionally. But at the same time, you always have to think about, other communities and reaction. Because if you lower standards in a way that helps people accomplish their narrower goal, but it's not going to be recognized by a broader community, then at the end of the day, you haven't done them a favor. What you've done is you've given them a limited, entry, rather than like a full reception, into the Jewish people. So the question of standards, raising them and lowering them, being flexible, being rigorous, being, is a very tricky question. And here is a great example of it. That's on the one hand, mishum aguna, we want to be mekel, and at the same time, the Gemara is saying, mishum aguna, to be mekel is to help, but it's not a help, if by making things more flexible, you're also making her long-term more vulnerable. So that is the same thing is true. That's what the Gemara means in Yevamos. There in Yevamos, here it's more, this is only a rabbinic requirement, and now we have to figure out what the standards should be. Should they be very rigorous or very flexible? The Gemara in Yevamos, it's almost the opposite. The Gemara is saying, we would like to find a way, mishum aguna, for her to move on with her life. But if it's called, if the dead man, if the deceased husband is going to show up in court one day, because we, were being empathetic and we were lowering the standards of proof, to establish really that he was dead, and this is all going to blow up, in her face, then you haven't done her any favors. So what is the right balance between these two things? That's exactly what our Gemara is speaking.
Two questions.
Yeah.
How much of this is an issue of the concerns of the klal, of the fact that the DNA of the Jewish people should not be polluted with mamzeris versus the individual, her issue? And
how much? Question.
And why isn't it affected by Rov and Chazaka?
Well, which case? Yevamos or
the last thing we heard of the guy, he was alive, so he has a cheskas of being alive, no?
Well, that's why the Gemara says it's a skazik surah and it's davar shebe'erva. So the Gemara says Eid Echad should really not help you here. Right. So when the Gemara ends up saying, Isha daika uminsava, chomer shechmarta aleha b'sofa, hekalta aleha b'tchilasa. So the Gemara is making a judgment, but they're saying we think this is an acceptable, calculated risk, meaning if it weren't for the fact that, getting it wrong is an irony here, right? Would blow up in her face, then we wouldn't rely on the Eid Echad for her to move forward. But since the consequences of being frivolous, and moving ahead.
You're talking about Yavamas now or Gittin? What are you talking about? Both cases? Yavamas or Gittin?
Well, right now I'm talking about Yavamos. In the case of Yavamos, what we're saying is, if you're going to accept an Eid Echad and, precipitously, get married, without further, investigation, then, that would be against your own interests because, even the remote possibility that he shows up one day ruins your life.
But generally, when the interests are not only hers but somebody else's, we would not use that clause.
These are all from the perspective of
to
get back to your first question. I think your first question is a really interesting question. Whether or not this is a question of Klal Yisrael and I think we do have that a lot. I for example, gave the first Mishnah in Masechet Ksuvos, talks about a woman getting, man and woman should get married preferably on a Wednesday because, if there's any confusion about her status, that, the next day the Bezin meets and they could, very rapidly, address that question and so on. So the first, we've discussed it a little bit in the past, I believe. So Tosas in Ksuvas asks the question. They say, well, really, even if it turns out that she, wasn't a basula, in the end of the day, it may not be that consequential because it's a sfek-sveka. That's like a double, suffix. When whatever took place that was untoward, took place. And a sfek-sveka, usually we don't, you were asking me about a rove or chazaka, right? Usually we don't care about that. So the Ran's, there are different answers to the question. The Ran's answer to the question is more like, in something where Besdin is involved, which I read to say, where the standards of Klal Yisrael are involved, we're more machmir. The way that we would treat a case, and Besdin, has a certain kind of special responsibility for the standards of Ishus, as they do the standards of
but it's also mekachtos.
No, yeah, but let's assume that's part of the sfek-svek. What we're saying is, meaning this is addressing your question, which is sometimes on an individual plane, when you weigh all the factors together, you might come to a certain halachic conclusion based on rov, based on chazaka, based on sfek-sveka, etc. And there still might be like another consideration, and that is, is Besdin signing on to this? That's the reputation, of the court. Or, is Klal Yisrael as a nation, as a corporate entity affected by this? Maybe, that's an added, concern, to calculate. But here in this Gemara about a mishum aguna hikilu, or in the case, whether it's this case or the case in Yevamos, it doesn't appear that Klal Yisrael factor is playing a role. It seems like the question of weighing, standards, lenient and stringent, is actually about a proper strategy, but a more complex strategy that in the end protects her interests, even as an individual. But where
Rove would not play a role?
Say again?
Rove would not play a role?
Well, no, Rove Rove plays a role, but Rove is not Shnayim Eidim. To overcome in a davar shebe'erva, Rove doesn't help you, right? Now, neither does a chazaka. Whether Rove helps you in
Even
context
what
of
we
Dinei
call
Mamonis.
even what we call a great Rove, I forgot the exact terminology.
Right, okay. I mean,
Well,
if
for
there's no
example,
put it this way.
After the
If there's-
Shoah, which is appropriate to talk maybe today for a second, there were many shilas regarding that. And of course, unfortunately, Rove, Shabarov, the people who didn't come back because they didn't come back.
Right. I mean, a lot of those questions are questions of, there are, as you say, when you have a very strong Rove, we're getting a little off the topic, but since, as you say, it is appropriate to talk about it, is when you have a very strong rove, sometimes we don't consider it what we call a hakra'ah, like you're deciding based on the rove. Some roves are so overwhelming. A rove means a probability, let's make it clear. Some probabilities are so compelling that we don't really have a suffix. Again, we had this when we learned Chulin a couple of years ago, and when we learned Psachim a couple of years ago, different sugyas, the question of efshal levarer, tzarech levarer. Let's say you have a rove, a probability, or a chazaka, and you also have the ability to investigate further, right, to eliminate even, the small miut, the minority view.
Remember, there's a machlokas.
Or can you just, 1 second, or can you just rely on the principle of Azlim and Basaro? So this is a major debate between, the Balamor and the Ramban, the Rajba and the Ra'ah. That's a big debate, but the consensus main view is Efshel Levarer, Tzarech Levarer. If you can figure out, you shouldn't rely on a rove. However, what the Ramban and those who say that say is that that's true if we're talking about a regular rove and a regular miyut. Let's say 60-40, 70-30. I'm making up the numbers. But let's say it's an overwhelming rove, what we call miyut she'eno matsui. So then they say that's different. There you don't have to check it out according to anybody. What's the idea? So this is, Rav Soloveitchik used to always characterize this. I'm sure others do too. There are different ways to say it. Some people say it, not like, it's a birur, not just a hachra, meaning we're really clarifying to the best of our own satisfaction, would say, what we think. We're really reconstructing, and we're satisfied, with reconstructing what happened or didn't happen here, as opposed to we have no idea what happened here, but the Torah allows us to project, that the majority, wins. But Rav Soloveitchik used to say it a little differently. It's more in the language than anything else. But I just thought his compelling way of saying it was sometimes the rove is so great, or the miut is so meager that there's not really a latest suffix. Meaning it eliminates the suffix in the sense, not statistically, but for example, I always try to give the example, you cross the street, right? So most people, when they cross the street, they don't say, I have a 99.3% of getting to the other side. It's worth the risk. That's not how people think. And that's not really how they, perceive their experience. They say, I'm crossing the street. Now, in a very small amount of cases, can tragedies happen and accidents happen when you're crossing the street? The answer is for sure. But from the legal standpoint, from the halachic standpoint, that's not just a strong rove. That's like until there's a problem, there's no problem. There's no latest suffix. So when you have a no latest suffix, so then you can say it's not that rove is machriya. The word hachra means, it's
Hasn't reached the critical mass to be considered relevant.
A serious suffix, right? So then, it's not that you've solved the problem with a rove. It's that you've determined there's not enough, concern. There is no problem legally. Do you understand what I mean? So that is related to all these things. But typically, when it comes to davar shebe'erva or chazaki surah, a rove would not be enough. You'd need edus. Edus. Now, again, just to make it perfectly clear. These are all complicated topics. In edus too, there are, on a practical level, edus isn't 100%. There are some people who lie. There are some people who fantasize, right? But the halacha treats edus as 100% until there's a problem. Like if it turns out that the people, it's what's called a din meruma, there are indication, which we're going to get to. Well, if we get to it today, we'll get to in just a couple of minutes, a fantastical case of din meruma, where everything smells terrible. Like it's hard to believe, what people are claiming or relying on, etc. So there's something called a din meruma. There's treyud trey. Let's say you have two witnesses, another two witnesses, dispute them, or hazama. But normally in the absence of counter indications, we, not only counter evidence, we treat evidence, testimony, as if it's 100%. People say that our reliance upon the Masorah, on Maimid Har Sinai and Gilui Shechina, and the giving of the Torah and the Torah Shabbal Peh, the oral law, is kind of all based on the principle of testimony. So no one thinks
it doesn't go so far as to create halachic reality that supersedes the reality when it shows up. So
that's exactly what I'm saying. 100%. Meaning we don't think that people are infallible, not in their moral character and not in their intellectual, capacity, to process what they really saw, but the law, establishes testimony as 100% certitude unless or until there's a problem with it. And the topic that we're dealing with now, Reish Lakish, is so extraordinary, precisely when you consider that. I mean, what is Reish Lakish saying? Reish Lakish is saying is this contract shows up in court. And, everything seems fine. We're going to assign a value of edus, to the signatures on this document. We're going to assume it, reflects real people. And even though they weren't necessarily there to see the Gerushin, but the combination of, their signing and it ending up in the hands, so let's say, of the Isha, that's what I keep calling, and this is how Reb Chaim understood it, but this is how he understood Reish Lakish. We consider this to be testimony in a way, like a blank check of testimony. That's very remarkable. 100%. It's considered 100% until we know that there's a problem with it. What's remarkable about Reish Lakish is the paradox, meaning it's one thing to say that the shtar, signed by the Eidim, is testimony that is treated no less and maybe even more than oral testimony, if at least we've passed the hurdle of establishing that it isn't a forgery. But can it even self-protect and claim that it's not a forgery? So that's where the Tosas now if we could move back to Tosas on Kavches, that Tosas Kavches asks this question, but not the way that I'm asking it, because I'm a bit of a theoretician. So what troubles me is the paradox. Like, if it's not already a valid contract, how can you assign to it all the powers of self-protection that that a contract has? The whole point is we haven't established sufficiently that it's a contract. That's the catch-22 paradox part of it. But Tosas wasn't troubled by that. They were troubled by the practical question. You're telling me that a contract validates itself, so aren't you inviting fraud? That's what Tosas asks. Look here on Chav Ches Amud Aleph. Tema kiven b'doraisa afilo ein edim sheyakiru chasimas ha'edim ashtar kosher. If you're going to tell me that biblically, right, even if no one can, has or can confirm these signatures, that we're still presuming this to be a proper shtar and that the signatures represent testimony, in ken kol adam sheyirtze yazayev, any person, any dishonest person can become a forger, right? V'yichtov, and he'll write out the document. V'yachtom, you're inviting fraud.
Well, you need two people to be complicit in this fraud, though. That makes it less probable.
No, so in the end of the day, I mean, Rashi explains Reish Lakish in Gittin, de lo chatzif inish leziyufe. So, what is that? I mean, that people are not chutzpahdik, they're not presumptuous enough, to forge. Meaning there's a taboo, people will lie and they'll cheat in all sorts of ways, but not forging a document. That they wouldn't do. And is that like a human nature comment or a Nilsa Davidi Legluye? They're afraid, that it's detectable, and then they'll have not just egg on their face, they'll be
And is it generational,
they'll
societal?
lose their reputation, and they'll say, not only did he cheat, nah, he shoplifted a little bit, he cheated a little bit, that's terrible, but he even forged a document. That's a level, a particularly egregious, kind of immorality or dishonesty. It's hard to know what it is, but for sure there's an umdana aspect to it, meaning if not for the fact that lo chotze finished l'zufe on
Well,
some,
the Gemara has
is
a
that human
few-
nature or is that a social comment?
We
It's
also
just
say
very hard to
that
know.
a person is not mechutza before his balchov. I mean, the Gemara establishes certain.
Right. But this is a particularly strong one if it's the basis of Rish Lakish, is what I'm trying to say. So
Just for a second, in regard to the single aid that came in the case of the woman.
in
Why?
which case, in the Yibamos or the here?
In both cases,
Yeah.
since halachically at that point, or in any other case where you have, let's say, two witnesses, you find out later on they were lying.
Yeah.
In the time period from the time they gave the testimony to the time they find they're lying, halachically, their testimony was accurate. So if the woman did something in between, like we married, why should she be responsible for that when halachically at that time she was doing the right thing?
Well, number one, it's not. I mean, they're possibly edus, and their edus it ends up being pasul mafreya. You're saying you mean sequentially in real time that we didn't know.
In other words, she acted.
Because I understand your question.
Halachically, the facts were in her side. There was
At the time.
Forget about
but
one
in
aid. There was two aid. Imagine two aid came. and said,
Right, I understand. What you're saying is basically she did nothing wrong.
No, even stronger than that. The
You're saying
halachic
she's
truth.
anusa.
We have something called the halachic truth. The halachic truth at that moment-
Yes and no. Meaning, in the end of the day, we now know factually that when she married this other person and subsequently bore his child, that she was an Ashish. So with
But was she if the halacha said she's not at that
Yes.
moment?
Yes, because the halacha at the moment says, we have no doubt that you are not an Ashish. But that has to be reassessed and reconstructed once the fellow showed up in court. So that's what I'm saying. I think your form. Sometimes there are things that are created by halachic reality. The halachic reality here is limited to the fact that until we have counter evidence, we consider this 100% certitude. But when we do have contrary evidence, then in retrospect, she was married to the first person.
So that every person who has
it's not a question of blame. It's now a question of
who has, let's say, two witnesses come and say, unfortunately, one of the spouses is the husband has passed away. He's died.
Yeah.
So every woman should have, even with two witnesses, the fear of getting remarried.
No, because legally, that's called certitude until we know it's not. And how many cases of Baharog Viraglov are there when there are two witnesses, right? So that's just part of the system, meaning we're dealing with human beings, they're fallible, people lie, people, are delusional, but no, that's the beauty of it. When the two witnesses come and they say, even if the one witness comes, the assumption is that she is not an Ashish. But that's what the reason we have a Chomer Shechmart Aleh B'Sofa Hikalta Aleha B'Tchilasa is precisely because she, in the back of her mind, has to be a little worried about that. But in the end of the day, with her worry, it crosses the threshold of acceptable decision making. And I think the bigger point in terms of what you're asking is that there are halachos that depend on blame. If we were talking about punishment, you can't expect her to be more righteous than the system. She did everything right. She did nothing wrong.
Otherwise, the system would collapse. If everybody had to pause and wait when you had
Right, exactly. So she did nothing wrong. If it were, there are issues like onshim or things that depend on blame, and then we say onus rachmana patre, and things of that sort. The problem here is that it's not about blame. It's a factual question, just about a child that was produced, in a circumstance where she was married to someone else, and objectively we now know that was never resolved, is a mamzer, even if everybody is totally in it. That's part of the tragedy. In this case particular, it's a tragedy. It's Teitzi Mizu Mizu, and the Vlad is a mamzer, and no one's to blame. Now, can that happen with a just Rabbona Shalom? Again, with today's Yom HaShoah, there are things that happen, in the world that are unjust, even with the hashgacha of the Rabbona Shalom. Doesn't mean he doesn't have hashgacha, and we don't understand it. And part of being, a mamin is to be able to say, this is tragic. We really don't understand it. It's a terrible mystery. And we can't reconcile ourselves to it, but we have to move on.
Recording.
So that's really something like, obviously, I'm not comparing the plight of an individual, to a third of our people, but on a very small scale, the idea that the Rambam says this in early in Moreh Nevuchim. He says there is no system, no objective legal system or philosophical system, even if it's divinely engineered or constructed, that will never produce, an injustice. Because by definition, if rules or law are objectified, then there will always be cases, even with the perfect Rabbona Shalom, they'll, now again, if you ask, Onesh min hashamayim, that's not our job, but of course, that's where the Rabbona Shalom gets to decide. He knows who's innocent and who's guilty and who's blameless, but in terms of the concept, for the greater good of the system and the people who benefit from it, there will always be cases. That's what the Rambam says in Moreh Nevuchim, and we know this in life.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. Anyway. Okay. Anyway, so that's my response. We're off a little bit off of the. So I want to start this anyway. So this idea of the self-protective mechanism of the shtar is a very intriguing idea. The question is, how far do we push it? Did Rabbi Roth want to say something or not? I just thought, did I cut you off? Or we're okay? Okay, seems like we're good. I thought Rabbi Roth was trying to say something before.
I have some question, but I don't know whether it's my interest is sufficient to justify the question. We live in a world of probability. It is very difficult to say that anything whatsoever is certain.
Right.
Now,
it's a legal concept, not a mathematical.
But my question, I'm wondering whether the Beis Din Chazal have the power, by virtue of their status, to transform something that is merely probable, I'm speaking of facts, into a definite fact. In other words, they have the power to change, you might say, reality or something like that.
Well, again, they're not changing reality here in the sense that they told you, the husband died and you are allowed to remarry, and then Bahorag Baraglav, it's still going to be Teitzim Mizev Mizev Avlad Mamzer. So Ad Kedei Kach, they can't change reality. But as I was responding before, what they can do is say, as far as the information that we have right now, you have 100% license, and you should not, be reticent in any way, to move forward with your life. Like, let's say the one would say, there's no evidence of any problem. I'm not going to move forward with my life because I'm worried that the edus is false. The Beis Din would say that's not something you have to worry about, because edus is 100% until we know it's not.
I think there are those
but it can be not when it turns out that factually it was not.
I think that there are those who claim that Beis Din Chazal have that power.
Well, they definitely don't have the power in these cases.
Change reality from merely probable to certain.
Well, as I say, we're treating it as certain, but there will be limitations to that when actual factual contradictory evidence surfaces. Certainly in this case, I mean, the Mishnah, that's a Mishnah. The Mishnah in the beginning of Isha Rabbah that we began with says that, if she got remarried based on 2 witnesses, and you can't bet better than that, Trey Kameya, but then the fellow shows up in court, Bahorog Baraglov, Teitzi Mizel Mizev Avlad Mamzer. In other areas of halacha, maybe, but each, you have to, assess each one. Here also, unless you say, this is the question that the Gemara asks in a bunch of places about Afkin Rabbanon L'Kiddushin. The Gemara says, how can certain takanos drabanan interfere with biblical laws? Mi'ikemidi, says the Gemara, is it possible that B'nat Torah, she's an Eishes Ish, and you're going to be matir her l'shuk? The answer is, the Gemara says, no, not really, but Afkin Rabbanon L'Kiddushin. There's kind of an implicit, clause, in the marriage, that allows you, kind of to invoke like an alternative, to how this, ishus, unfolds. But otherwise, there are certain realities that are just unshakable. If she was an Eishes Ish, and that's been established because he showed up in court, then as much as she's totally blameless and was working, without at the time any risk and without any kind of restraint, we're still tragically going to have to deal with the new reality. But it's a fascinating question, no question. Okay, so I just wanted to bring the following. We're gonna have to stop in a couple of minutes. This idea of the self-protective mechanism of the shtar, which is a fascinating reality, triggered like a lot of discussion, understandably, both on a practical level and also testing this concept. So if you look on page 1 of these Marmakomos, I have the Rambam here in Perek Zayin, Hilchos Gerushin Halacha Beis. The Rambam in Perek Zayin, Hilchos Gerushin Halacha Beis, says something very controversial. He says, Bahabal, the ear air. What happens in this case that we're talking about in our Gemara, which is a get surfaces, the shliach, let's say it this way: a get surfaces, the woman, wants to remarry on the basis of this get, let's say, and then after she's holding the get and she's, about, to take the plunge. Let's say she didn't take the plunge yet. So the Baal shows up in court, the husband, and he is ma'arer. He challenges. He says, I never sent this get. That's the Rambam's case. Bo habal v'irer, the husband came to court and he challenged. The Amar, and he said, Lo gerashti me'olam, I never divorced her. What about this bill of divorce in her hands? The get shehuvala, the get that was transmitted in my name to her, mizuyafu, it is a forgery. So the Rambam says, Yiskayim bechosamav. You're going to have to authenticate this get to see that, that there really are, these people exist and this is really their signature, the Aden. V'im lo niskayim, says the Rambam, if you can't authenticate the divorce contract, v'lo nodu edav klal, and we can't identify who the Edom are, teitzei v'havlad mamzer. Meaning, if she remarries on the basis of this get that is now disputed, and you can't resolve the dispute, then her second marriage is invalid, and an offspring that is produced in that second marriage would be a mamzer.
So what is the word teitzei?
Shaharei, just one more second, eina migureshes, because she isn't, in other words, the challenge of the husband, if it's not neutralized will torpedo the get. That's what the Rambam writes. So everybody asks against this Rambam, what happened to our Gemara? Didn't our Gemara say that Kiyum Shtaros is only midrabanan because Minat Torah we rely on Reish Lakish, and the edim of the shtar or the signatures are self-validating? Where's the self-validation here? Right? The Rambam seems to be acknowledging a circumstance in which the requirement of Kiyum Shtaros is Doraisa, not Drabana. Isn't that against the Gemara on Chav Ches Samad Aleph in Ksuvas? Isn't that even more importantly against the Gemara on Gimel Amud Aleph in Gittin? That's the problem. All the Nosei Kelim, ask this question. They're all troubled. I'm sorry, the Chazan wanted to ask.
No, I don't understand, because on one hand he says Teitzei, that it sounds to me as if she becomes a free woman, and immediately after that he said, but if the Vlad comes in, then it's a mamzer.
No, the Teitzei is
She has to leave the husband.
the new husband, meaning the Teitzei refers to the second marriage. If the first husband comes to court and complains and says she never got a proper divorce from me, meanwhile she got married on the basis of this divorce and produced a child in the second marriage, right? So the Rambam says Teitzei, she has to
Leave the second husband.
She has to leave, and the child that was produced is a mamzer.
Wow.
Yeah. So this is a very controversial Rambam. So we're going to have to stop in a minute. I'm going to talk about this next time. But before we get to that, so this is actually a very interesting kind of little, window into, some halachic topics. This principle of Reish Lakish, is the cornerstone of Jewish contract law. I've mentioned that in the past. So in addition to this Rambam and this Gemara, is the key to it all, this self-validating idea. But what's fascinating is that there was a kind of an outrageous case, a real case, that took place in Ashkenaz, and where Rabbi Vigdor, this is quoted in Nagos Mordechai in Masechet Kiddushin, the end of Kiddushin. We're going to read it next time, so if everybody could have the Mar Makomos, it would help. It's just an extraordinary case. So there was this case where somebody produced a shtar Kiddushin and claimed that this, young woman was married, and there was tons of evidence that the whole thing was a fraud, a hoax. Right, and the question is, do you apply the din of Reish Lakish that a shtar or contract protects itself or validates itself, even in circumstances where there are all sorts of challenges? The witnesses themselves said that it was a forgery. The husband said it was a forgery. It was like a whole. You have to read this case to believe it a little bit. Anyways, there was this case, and this Rabbi Vigdor, ruled, that we can ignore this shtar, that unless it's authenticated, it's invalid. And then that triggered a response by one of his colleagues and contemporaries, the author of the Or Zarua, Rabbi Yitzchak Or Zarua, Vienna. It's a fascinating thing. So, there's a lot of poetry on both sides. We'll look at it. It's really interesting. So the Or Zarua thought that this was scandalous, that Rabbi Vigdor, who was his friend, would kind of limit the power of Reish Lakish. And he argues that even though this looks fraudulent, you have to treat it, as if there's a valid contract. And this exchange between Rabbi Vigdor and the Or Zarua, which is about such basic principles, but in such a crazy scenario, it became the locus classicus of understanding Reish Lakish. Ad kedei kach, that if you look at the Shulchan Aruch, the Sma, the Shach, they're all, arguing about this case.
Wasn't Reish Lakish's idea basically a default position but not if it's under serious attack?
So that's the question. What some people say for the Rambam and what people said for Rabbi Vigdor was there's a missing case, when you look at the Gemara. And the question is it really a missing case or not? Meaning, our Gemara really says that Kiyum Shtaros is Drabanan, but it doesn't say Kiyum Shtaros is Drabanan, even if there's Iru Rabal, even if there's an accusation, and an appeal, by the Baal. What it really says is if you have a contract that shows up in court, so midrabanan, you can't operate on the basis of that contract without first authenticating the signatures. But minatorah, default, you really could because of Reish Lakish. So at minimum, the Gemara says that default, anytime a document appears in court, the presumption is that it's a kosher document.
Well, actually, you can even go.
Does that mean that it would, one second, does that go as far as to defend the document against an explicit attack that says it's invalid? That's where Rabbi Vigdor and possibly the Rambam, qualify Reish Lakish somewhat. So that's what we're going to
You can
see.
go even further. You can say that it can sustain an attack, but not proof. It's one
What do
thing
you
to
mean?
make a claim. There's a difference between a default position that simply says, once you bring the star, I don't have to ask any further questions. That's stage one.
Oh, I see. Mean you're talking about
Somebody
when
says,
the
wait a minute, I object, but he's not sufficient. He's one person. Okay, the star still stands up. Okay, but if two agents come, that could be.
So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about all these conditions because they're really consequential in contract law and in Gittin and so on. But it's fascinating how this one case, and it's a historical note too, the response of the Or Zarua, who was a contemporary of Rabbi Vigdor, was known, but it wasn't known that it was the Or Zarua, or at least it wasn't clear to people, because the
Or Zarua was the repository of previous generational.
what happened was the Marik, who lived much later, lived 300-400 years later. He quotes the Or Zarua without mentioning his name, but the response to Rabbi Vigdor in his tshuvas, and a lot of the poskim picked it up from there. So they all assumed that it was the Marik, who lived 300 years later, who was arguing with Rabbi Vigdor, not realizing the Shach made this comment. The Shach said, no, you got it all wrong. Marik is quoting a contemporary of Rabbi Vigdor. Even the Shach, who had a great library, did not know that the author of this other tshuva was the prominent, author of the Or Zarua. We have the Or Zarua, and we now, have the whole, two exchange. Actually, we're two letters that were exchanged. But it's a very interesting.
Or Zarua was also the Masorah, so to speak, funnel from many previous generations. So his outlook was not only his; it was outlook from previous generations.
Yeah, but the truth is these are contemporaries. The Mordechai is that too. I mean, Sefer Mordechai, also preserves early Ashkenaz, Tosafistic kind of writings. But actually these are colleagues. But it's you'll see it's Rabbi Vigdor and his father-in-law and his Rebbe and
Nothing like a family fight.
and it's partially very respectful, but the actual case is just this shocking case of these two people who basically, it's like, from out of our news practically, these two people who hated each other, and I'm not exaggerating, that's how it's formulated, and they wanted to, kind of destroy each other's lives. So one fellow, hired a forgerer, to implicate, the daughter of his antagonist. So I want to read this and discuss some of I'm more interested in the concepts and the principles of Reish Lakish here, but you'll see it's just a very, it came from a real case, and it triggered a deeper understanding of this cornerstone concept, which is very, that the Kachi Darka Shel Torah. It's a living system, and people live it, and all sorts of crazy things happen that test the cases. And then the Chachamim, are given the responsibility to figure it out. And, Crystal clarifies, these concepts, and then they evolve from there. It's just the process is very fascinating. Anyway, so we'll continue with that Amir Hashem next week.
Good night.
I'm going to have to
Sure,
mention,
thank you.
just as a scheduling matter, and maybe I should just mention it now. Let me see if I can find. I have a wedding of a student that's on a Tuesday.
Lag Bomer, right? I mean, it's not next Tuesday.
I think it's Erev Lag Bomer, not next Tuesday. The wedding that I have is. Give me 1 second.
How can it be Erev Lag?
Has to be.
See,
3 weeks
Or
from now.
yeah, it's Lag Bomer. Tuesday, May
Yeah, it has to
9th.
be 3 weeks.
Yeah.
All right, so it's log. So you want to switch to Wednesday, or you'll tell us what you want to do?
I'll see if I can. I think I have something that Wednesday, but I'll let you know.
Okay. We won't do it from the wedding. You don't think so?
Well, I'm a Sada Kedushin at the wedding, so it's hard for me to get out. So.
Okay.
But if I can switch to Wednesday, I'll try to do that. Let me just see what the schedule is. But that would be,
Okay.
we'll have to do an adjustment Tuesday, May 9th, but we'll figure it out.
Okay. Thank you so much. Good night,
Okay, have
Rabbi.
a good
Thank
week,
you.
everyone. And we'll continue with Rabbi Vigdor, the Rambam, and the Or Zarua, and the Shach, hopefully, next week. And then we'll move on to other Edachanem and Bisurim topic.
Looking forward. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh.
Thank you.